Hello, I'm Pastor Greg Anderson from Trinity Lutheran Church in Grand Prairie, Alberta. Greetings from the 55th parallel. I have not posted anything for a couple of weeks because I've been under the weather. The thing that is being described as not as bad as COVID, but worse than a cold, entered into my body. And I am presently grateful for the wonder that is antibiotics. That seems to be kind of kicking it out of my system. But you may still hear it a bit in my throat. It's that, and it's pretty smoky again. We got a bit of a reprieve from the smoke, and we're kind of back at it. So, yes, a little hoarse. I'm going to be presenting the prayer of the day, gospel lesson, and the message I gave this morning at our worship on this second Sunday after Pentecost. And so let us pray. O God, you are the source of life and the ground of our being. By the power of your Spirit, bring healing to this wounded world and raise us to the new life of your Son, Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen. The gospel lesson for today is taken from the Gospel according to St. Matthew. We are in now a green season. That means that the cloths that are hanging on the altar and the podium and the stole, the kind of draping that I wear on my alb are green. We have that after Pentecost and during the Epiphany season. And it's literally a green season. It's a time for growth. It's a time when we look at what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ and what following Christ looks like. And so the gospel lessons then kind of skip around. It's not a kind of a straight narrative. And so we go back to Matthew chapter 9. Now, the way this is set out, and I'll put it in the notes, there are two sections I'm going to read. I'm not going to read the middle section. That's very uncharacteristic for me. Typically, if a gospel reading is kind of broken up and it omits something, I tend to read it to give it context. This time it really does kind of take away, kind of distracts from the message I find in the passage anyway. So I will put those omitted verses in the notes. And so if you want to read the whole thing, it involves a conversation between Jesus and some disciples of John who are still around. Some of the apostles used to be disciples of John. During Jesus' ministry, there are disciples of John still present. In fact, there are still, it's kind of a smaller church, faith community, that still attributes its center to the teachings of John the Baptist. But anyway, so I am going to omit those verses. But again, as I said, I'll put them in the notes. But this reading is from Matthew chapter 9. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." While he was saying these things to them, suddenly a leader of the synagogue came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." And Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples. Then suddenly a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. For she said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be made well." Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. When Jesus came to the leader's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl got up. And the report of this spread throughout that district. Pardon. The joys of chilled Vietnamese coffee. So, it's interesting. I'm stammering a bit because just in reading this passage, I caught something I hadn't caught before. I like that. I like that after 40 years of ministry, I'm still catching stuff, but I didn't catch it this morning when I read it, but I caught it just then. Okay. People who know me, and actually you don't have to know me very well, know that I am a profound student of the game of hockey. No, I'm not. I've seen one NHL game in person when I was young. My father took me to a Golden Seals game in Oakland, California, a franchise that went on to go to Minnesota and Hartford and got split up. But they were playing Toronto, and I thought in my youthful years that they were playing the Toronto Make-Believes. Now, if you don't like Toronto, you may find that funnier, but that's what I thought. I wasn't sure what a maple leaf was. I would go on to serve in Canada at least 20 of my 40 years of ministry, but 25 years. But at the time, I had no clue. So it was the Seals and the Maple Leafs. My father and I sat there and had no clue what was happening. I'm not quite sure why my dad got the tickets. Now, my parents both grew up in Chicago. It's not that they didn't grow up around a place where there was a hockey team, but it just didn't enter our vocabulary, our experience. My father was, I would say, first and foremost, a football fan. I remember as a young man being allowed, because I was my older sister and my mother. Well, my older sister would kind of be in her room. My mother would be kind of getting lunch ready, and I got to sit with my dad and watch football. My dad was a 49er faithful at a time when that's all it was. The 49ers were awful, so you had to be faithful. And when football was over, my dad was a baseball fan. He didn't watch as much baseball as he did football, but he watched a lot of baseball. My dad was a Cubs fan, again, at the time. Oof. It was tough. To be a 49ers and Cubs fan was brutal. My mother, who grew up in Chicago, was a Detroit fan. And in terms of baseball, again, I did not have much in terms of hockey or even basketball. It wasn't. It was football, and then it was baseball. And this was all before Gretzky. When Gretzky went to the Kings, suddenly we have the Kings, we have the Sharks. Now, there's, there are franchises all over. And I raised this because I was actually watching a hockey game yesterday. In terms of the Stanley Cup and the finals, it's Florida and Las Vegas. I mean, when did that happen? I know it's charitable when it happened, but I think if you told my father at some point, even though he wasn't much of a hockey fan, that the powerhouses of 2023 would be in Florida and Las Vegas, nope, wouldn't have happened. In fact, I believe there's a game tonight that could decide if Vegas wins. That's it. The World Hockey Champion. Well, no, hockey isn't quite as arrogant as football. The NHL champions will be from Las Vegas. Now, I know how all this happened. There was a minor reason and a major reason. The minor reason, of course, is the movement of people. A lot of those franchises that went to the South in Arizona, Texas, have gone where, frankly, Northerners and Canadians go to spend the winter. The primary reason, of course, is money. It's what drives most sports. Uh, we have billionaires who are buying teams for billions, who are then expecting um, most of the fans then to pick up the tab because they can't waste their billions on arenas. But I'm not bitter. Anyway, um, it money and the movement of people, I suppose, has changed hockey. You look where football does not quite have that, doesn't have quite that same uh, sense. I think baseball, weather is a consideration. Um, it seems to me hockey is one of those sports that has just spread apart from what would be kind of its beginnings, I guess. But change happens, right? Change happens for a lot of reasons. People move around. Money is a big motivator. Um, and who we know, how who what our communities look like. I mean, there's just change, and sometimes that change is um, we receive it well, and sometimes it's a challenge to us. It just that it just kind of is. In the gospel reading today, there's a lot of change going on, which happens whenever Jesus is around. Jesus just kind of carries change with him. He was grown up. He was raised by observant Jews. He was raised to be an observant Jews. The apostles, and I would say most of the, if not all of the disciples, are observant Jews. When they're in Jerusalem, they go to the temple. When they are elsewhere, they go to synagogue. That's how this thing unfolds. And yet, Jesus pretty routinely, um, you know, um, turns on its head, I suppose, some of those, not just social norms, but aspects of the law, the Mosaic law, the Jewish law. And if we take, as I'm doing, that conversation with the disciples of John out, that's what we have, are these events of Jesus, doing that very thing around a phrase, and we're going to get to that phrase here in a moment. So Jesus is traveling along, we're told, and as Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. Now, Matthew, is the tax collector. It's how he's characterized, in the Gospels, and the tax booth, and this is something I'm not sure I settled on or really kind of realized, but it's kind of a toll booth. Most occupations, particularly being a fisherman, being a shepherd, it was, birth to marketplace. For fishermen, as are a lot of the apostles, they go out, they catch the fish, they bring the fish in, they transport the fish to the marketplace, and they sell the fish. With sheep, you protect the sheep. The sheep have lambs. You raise the sheep, and some of those sheep then go to slaughter and go to the marketplace. And you did that. You had to go through the toll booth, as it were. So on your way to take your fish to market, you stopped at this tax booth to give the Romans their slice. We need to remember that the government during Jesus' day was Rome. And I said this before, but the Romans learned from the Greeks. The Greeks had a lot of administration, in the Greek kingdom. The Romans, pretty simple. They'd conquer an area and were smart enough to say, look, you can have your gods, you can have, most of the part of your culture, most of your worship. We ask for two things. Don't kill anybody. Capital punishment was in the hands of Rome, and pay your taxes. Jesus' birth is around one of these taxation events. And Matthew is a part of this machine that collects the taxes for Rome. Now, tax collectors were unpopular because what the Romans would do, they would hire local people to collect these taxes. So Jews were collecting taxes for Rome from Jews, and that was resented. But this booth would be, the fish, sheep, whatever, grain, I suppose, crops, would come by the booth. The tax would be, determined and paid, and then you could go on your way. It was one of those places where I suppose if there was a side road possible, it would be taken. But this was just a part of life, and that's where Matthew was. Now, it's interesting that Jesus, in terms of the apostles, tends to, when we hear about these call stories, he's calling them while they're at work, as it were. Fishermen who are in their fishing boats, Jesus calls. Fishermen who are mending their nets, Jesus calls. Matthew, who is at the tax booth, is called. That's a whole different inquiry, a bit of a rabbit hole, I suppose, on why does Jesus call people when they're in the midst of their jobs. He doesn't go in the evening. He doesn't, knock on their door at night. No, he catches them at work. And so he goes to Matthew and says, "Follow me." Now, this is a major thoroughfare. That's why they would put the tax booth there. And it's likely that Matthew may have seen Jesus, may have heard Jesus speak. But when Jesus, looks him in the eye and says, "Follow me," Matthew gets up and follows him. It's akin to the other apostolic call stories. There's no hesitation. They simply go. Now, it's interesting that the next thing we hear, so he got up and followed him. And as he, Jesus, sat at table in the house, it's what happens after the apostle is called. We don't get much of that with the fishermen. They're at the lake. I mean, they have to go somewhere. Here, Jesus calls Matthew. Matthew follows him and escorts Jesus directly to his home, where he has a feast. He has a party, as it were. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. Now, tax collectors and sinners is kind of a catch-all term. Some commentators will say sinners is kind of code for prostitutes. I think it's a wider net, as it were, than that. Tax collectors were despised. Remember, nobody liked tax collectors. Not just because they didn't like to pay taxes, nobody does, but they also don't, they were seen as betraying their faith, betraying their people. So nobody wanted to hang with them. Now, in Jesus' day, and in a lot of far Middle and Near Eastern cultures, sharing food with someone, sharing a meal with someone, was a way of saying, that person's okay with me. To identify with them, with kind of condone them. And so who's going to go to a tax collector's house and, condone them, besides other tax collectors and other sinners, because we're going to meet the Pharisees here in a minute, people who would be considered sinners by their, religious authorities. And so they're the ones who come to the dinner. And Jesus, throughout the Gospels, Jesus has this odd habit. When somebody says, "Jesus, will you come to my house?" Jesus says, "Yes." Jesus is not a refuser of invitations. If there's an opportunity to sit with people over food, interact with them, teach, Jesus takes it. The Gospels are full of those stories and full of Jesus getting in trouble because of that. And so he's at this dinner. There's tax collectors, sinners, outcasts, people who aren't welcome anywhere else. And the Pharisees say to his disciples, not to his face, mind you, but his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Now, a good retort from the disciples might be, "Well, why don't yours?" They don't say that, but it's a good question. Why wouldn't they have this meal for the very same reason Jesus would? But Jesus hears it and says, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." Now, who's a sinner? Everybody. Everybody's a sinner. Paul puts it, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Everybody's a sinner if a sinner is defined as someone who does not perfectly obey the law. If that's the measure, and it is for the Pharisees, then everybody's a sinner, including the Pharisees. I mean, there's no perfect obedience for 613 laws. It just doesn't happen. What I want to look at is that phrase, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Now, and I'll put this in the notes too, the Old Testament lesson, first lesson today, is from Hosea. And it captures this quote, right? That's what Jesus is referring to. Or even in Hosea, a prophet of the Hebrew Scriptures, says God doesn't, it's not about burnt offerings. It's not about sacrifices. Because sacrifice is a legal term, right? If there was a sin, if there was a misstep, the law determined the sacrifice that was made to undo that sin, undo that misstep. So it's not just sacrifice like making a sacrifice to do something. It's a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice. And Jesus is saying, quoting Hosea, God, desire mercy and not sacrifice. And so how does that mercy shown? Well, we've seen it shown already. Jesus calls Matthew, which made the Pharisees a little tense, because Jesus called someone who was not tolerated by those who would be considered, the cream of the crop in terms of the elite of Jesus' day. And I think these two healing stories, which we're going to look at briefly here, Jesus is demonstrating what does it mean to show mercy, require mercy and not sacrifice. So first, and this is the thing I didn't notice, I haven't noticed till this time, 40 years of ministry. While he was saying these things, and that's the conversation with the disciples of John, which took place in the house, in Matthew's home, suddenly the leader of the synagogue came in. So they're still in the house. They're still in Matthew's house. They're still at the banquet, which I didn't catch before. It just didn't sink in. But it's important because Jesus is in this meal, right, with the tax collectors, with the sinners, with those the Pharisees object to, although the Pharisees are there too. Who's going to say no to dinner? But this leader of the synagogue, who's an important person in his community, the leader of the synagogue was kind of the synagogue manager. It was a post of pride, of status. Your people, liked you, respected you. And that leader of the synagogue comes into Matthew's house, full of tax collectors and sinners, and kneels before Jesus and says, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." Now remember what Jesus does with invitations? And Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples. The man goes, "Look, my daughter's dead, but if you come, I know you can raise her up." And Jesus, seen by his action, says, "Yes, I can do that. And yes, I will do that." Okay, let's go. And it's in Matthew's house, and Matthew is now a disciple. Matthew's now a follower. So it's quite possible that Matthew goes, "Okay, I guess we're going." And so off they go. And this is, they're determined. And this is what gets them out of the house, right? Now, as they're going, suddenly, and that's not a Matthew term, Mark, things happen suddenly all the time. Matthew's very impatient, or Mark is. In Matthew, these two suddenlies are, I think, meant to go, whoa, that happened. Whoa, something else happened. And so as they're going toward the leader of the synagogue's home, suddenly a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. Now, in Mark, these stories are bigger or more detailed. And that's, Matthew's not concerned about that, right? Those aren't the stories. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, I think, is what Matthew's using these stories to demonstrate. And so the detailed unfolding isn't as significant. Now, one of the things to remember about mercy is Jesus has been asked to go and minister to, as it were, a dead body. That's a red flag in terms of sacrifice, in terms of Jewish law. Touching a dead body made you ritually unclean. Couldn't go to synagogue, couldn't go to temple, couldn't go, had to take care of that with sacrifice. But Jesus is not hesitating to go in the midst of that. An issue of blood would do the same thing. This woman with this hemorrhage is, for 12 years, in Mark's story, she's gone to physicians and has got no relief. But she has this flow of blood, which makes her ritually unclean. And so she's in this crowd, which likely some of these people would have known her, but she's really trying to just kind of get in, touch his cloak, and get out. She does not want to call attention to herself, but she wants to be healed. She is desperate. And so, as is the leader of the synagogue, his daughter's dead. He is desperate. This woman has had this flow of blood for 12 years. She is desperate. And she does indeed touch the hem of his garment, but what she wanted to do is touch, heal, leave. She touches, not healed yet. Jesus turns, we're told. Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. So Jesus wants the encounter. And so, the healing event isn't completed until Jesus turns, sees her, and says to her, "Daughter," this kind of precious kind of address to her, "take heart." I mean, she's had this flow of blood for 12 years. She's been ritually unclean. She hasn't been able to go to the temple, hasn't been able to go to the synagogue, hasn't really been, people would have to be careful about associating with her. So take heart. Big message. Your faith has made you well. And faith here is not content. What is her faith? The content of her faith is her desperation. If I touch the fringe of his garment, I'll be made well. She trusted that would happen, and Jesus delivers. She is healed. But again, mercy over sacrifice, right? As long as she's in this perpetual state of hemorrhage, she can't make the sacrifices that will return her to her life. And having contact with her, having her touch him, the ritual uncleanness was kind of contagious, but that's not dealt with. That's not addressed. It's the mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. It says elsewhere in Scripture, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." So that healing occurs, but now we have to get back underway, right? He's going to the leader of the synagogue's house, and he gets there, and we're told the flute players and the crowd was making a commotion. Now, again, a lot of Middle Eastern cultures have the community grieves, and there would have been people in the leader of the synagogue's community, in his synagogue, who would have had the tasks of providing the music, providing the wailing, providing the grieving of the community, and they're already there. He's left, but she has died, and so those mechanisms are already underway. And so his home is in grief already. And here's Jesus, this rabbi, walks in and says, "Look, she's only sleeping." And they laugh. They think it's funny. I don't know about that. I think they're more respectful than that. But there's that kind of nervous kind of laugh, like, "What are you talking about?" And there is, if the leader hadn't gone to get Jesus, if the leader hadn't had this faith that Jesus could do something, if Jesus hadn't responded to the invitation by going, it might have been cruel to say she's just sleeping. But the leader of the synagogue, the father of this child, is on board. And so as they laugh, Jesus, the room is cleared, and Jesus reaches out and takes the hand of the girl, which you don't do, because now there are sacrifices involved, having touched a dead body. But he reaches out, takes her hand, and raises her up alive, which I suppose mitigates the sacrifice. She's not dead. Technically, when he touched her, she was dead, but she's alive again. So That's a tricky one. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl got up. Now, in Mark's telling, I like the fact that he says, Jesus tells them to give her some food, give her something to eat. It's a kind of a demonstration that she's raised from the dead. She is alive. She can process food. There's not this kind of ramp up from being dead to being alive. She was dead. She is now alive. She is restored. It's the nature of Jesus, of miracles, of his healings. And the report of this spread throughout the district. Yeah, no kidding. So, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Jesus shows mercy by calling Matthew an outcast. Matthew responds by gathering all his friends to have this meal with Jesus. Jesus' mercy has this kind of contagion. And Matthew's already being apostolic. He's already, going out there, coming in, and sharing the message. Jesus is invited into this leader of the synagogue's home to raise his daughter. There's all kind of sacrificial law involved in this, but Jesus acts in mercy. The woman with the hemorrhages, there's all kinds of sacrificial law involved here. But Jesus, out of mercy, not only heals her, but restores her. Take heart, daughter. Your faith has made you well. Mercy over sacrifice. Mercy over judgment. Thanks be to God, right? I mean, we live day to day recipients of God's mercy because we are sinners. We are sinners every day. And we are not inflicted with judgment, but receivers of mercy. And so being a disciple, being a follower of Jesus, is in part living in this reality of our sin and God's mercy. And so this mercy is not delivered to the perfect. Mercy is delivered to those who need the mercy. Jesus came for the sick, and we're all a little sick. A very old and ancient quote by a old Christian musician who became a Christian musician, Barry McGuire, who would say, that in some ways Christianity is a crutch. And his response is, well, yeah, but a crutch is really helpful if you're crippled. We're all sinners. We're all frail. We're all broken. And what's God's response to that is not this demand for perfection. No, it's mercy. It's compassion. It's love. And so thanks be to God for that. That mercy is indeed what God desires, and not sacrifice. Amen.